House of the Dragon, the newest hit from George R.R. Martin, has taken HBO and the world by storm in its first few weeks of being on the air, as it brings fans of Game of Thrones back to a familiar place, with the inclusion of dragons, familiar house names and characters, and of course, a few other Westeros-specific practices that are impossible to ignore, even for writer George R.R. Martin. In today's video, we're going to be revealing what those practices are and how Martin feels about them. Stick around because you won't want to miss a second of this video. So what does House of the Dragon do that makes George R.R. Martin cringe? While House of the Dragon is made by Martin, he is still not 100% on board with some of the things that take place in the show. I mean, that adds up despite the fact that he is the creator of the series. There is so much murder and brutality that I'm sure no modern-day human would support, along with things that will never happen. But there is one thing that has happened before in human history, and that occurs often on both Game of Thrones and House of the Dragon, that Martin simply does not agree with. And that thing, of course, is incest. Of course, nobody agrees with incest, but it was not totally ridiculous to assume that a guy who writes graphic novels that include a great deal of sex scenes and incest doesn't think about it just a bit too much for comfort, right? Well, on a red carpet event for House of the Dragon, Martin was asked if he has a stance on incest and why he includes it so much in his content, and he was quick to say that he certainly does not endorse incest. I may write about incest, but I do not endorse it. Let's make that perfectly clear, said Martin. Incest is actually a huge plot point in both these shows, so it was not a crazy thought to be had by some reporters at the event. On Game of Thrones, Jaime and Cersei Lannister engage in the practice pretty often during the show's runtime, and eventually fan favorite Jon Snow accidentally finds out that his lover Daenerys was actually his aunt. But on this show, the incest dial is turned up to 11 and intertwined into the plot much more than it has ever been before. Why is this vile act so common in this show? Obviously, the show takes place in a fictional land, the Kingdom of Westeros, but is meant to mimic the events of medieval Europe with royal dynasties sitting on the throne, fighting for power and land against the nobility of other lands. Incest and incestual marriage were actually common practice between royal siblings, cousins, aunts and nephews, uncles and nieces, you name it. The point was to keep bloodlines pure, as the ill effects of inbreeding were unclear to people at the time. The same concept is used in House of the Dragon with the Targaryen family, who are currently on the Iron Throne. Of course, by the time Game of Thrones rolls around, they are already off the Iron Throne and have been overthrown. However, during their reign, they practiced incest because they thought themselves better than everybody else, and did not want to taint their bloodline with people who were not of their royal blood. In the show, they claim that all Targaryens have the blood of the dragon, and they need to ensure that every Targaryen is pure. This, of course, is one of the reasons why they were overthrown come the events of Game of Thrones. But despite the Targaryens being off the Iron Throne, the practice of incest doesn't stop in Westeros. You would think that the eventual ill effects that come from years of inbreeding would eventually get people to stop doing it, but even some 200 years later, during the events of Game of Thrones, it's still happening. It kind of makes you question why Martin keeps writing it, right? Not the way they do it in Westeros. I say avoid incest at all costs. Martin joked at the same red carpet premiere event. So if he's so against it, why has it been such a common theme in all of his graphic novels and TV shows? Is there any reason to portray incest other than historical accuracy? In my opinion, I would be having incest on the show as little as possible. If it is the one story thread I think I can be implied and maybe verbally confirmed between the characters, but there's no reason to actually show it multiple times. It did get to the point in which Martin was concerned for the production of Game of Thrones and thought that the incest would raise too many eyebrows from the executives and viewers alike. But it is even more common on this show than before. So why does he use it so much? Well, Martin said that he uses the vile act as a way to depict the darkest side of humanity and the fact that these people who are regarded as idols to the public are capable of some truly terrible things. He wants the audience to recognize the bad characters when they come on screen as the lowest of the low by making them do something that only a true scumbag would ever do. Moreover, in House of the Dragon, Targaryens are the leaders of Westeros and are considered to be better than everyone else. So the audience might actually form a bond or connection with them that is anything but hatred and disgust. However, with the addition of incest to this family's many brutal and disgusting acts, it makes the audience want to hate them even more. If the Targaryen characters were just seen committing murders, stealing, and ruling unjustly, there would be a chance that the audience doesn't truly hate them as much as the show wants them to. Of course, the show wants the audience to hate the Targaryens and come along for the ride of a lifetime, as their empire slowly slips away from them and Westeros falls into the disarray that is at its peak during Game of Thrones. I'm sure you could argue that there are other ways to make us hate this family as much as the writers want us to, but those acts would also have to be truly terrible. And Martin has already been scrutinized enough for his shows being too graphic, and while he disagrees with the notion at times, he has stated that he doesn't want to offend people too much just to tell a story. Martin thinks we need to take a chill pill. Back when the Game of Thrones ruled Sunday night with an Iron Throne, the show was praised for its amazing acting and wild story, but it was also heavily criticized for two things. Critics and fans said that the show gratuitously showed sex and violence like it was going out of style. People were fed up with the constant need to watch something that you probably shouldn't be able to see on TV, the various sex scenes, the incredible graphic violence like the entire Red Wedding episode, and of course, incest. But while Martin obviously doesn't endorse any of these things like we see them in the shows, he does think that we are unnecessarily dulling his story and others that take a trip to the wild side. Martin said that in House of the Dragon, we shouldn't be expecting as much sex scenes or scenes with intense violence due to the backlash received from Game of Thrones. But he also said that he disagrees with trimming the show back. Martin believes that the sex scenes should not be as heavily scrutinized in shows shows, and he's truly baffled by the fact that more people complain about seeing sex than seeing violence. Martin thinks that sex scenes should be more common in TV shows. Sex is such a natural and beautiful part of life, whereas violence is so disgusting and uncommon in human life, yet audiences seem totally fine watching movies and shows that are basically unhinged violence for hours on end. While we can expect to see less sex and violence in the series than we did in Game of Thrones, we certainly will not be devoid of these things in this show. They will both certainly be commonplace and already have been so far in the few episodes that have been released in Season 1. I'm sure we'll have more implied instances of both of these things in the show, and less actual viewings of these things, which I think is the perfect compromise. The audience will still get the brutality and story implications from implied violence, and they will get the plot intricacy changes with implied relations. It will be a change for fans of Game of Thrones, but a welcomed one for most fans, I'm sure. That's all we have for you guys today on the channel. Thank you all so much for tuning in. We hope you enjoyed the content, and we'll see you all in the next one.